The room fell silent as the Dreseri ambassador entered. His blue-gray skin reflected the harsh lights of the United Nations chamber. 7 feet tall with 4 arms and eyes that glowed like amber, Commander Vexthul looked down at the human delegation with barely concealed disdain. Captain Susan Miller stood at attention beside General William Rogers. As Earth's military liaison, she had been chosen for this first contact meeting because of her diplomatic skills and 20 years of combat experience. She watched the alien delegation closely, noting how they moved with the precision of trained soldiers. "We welcome you to Earth," said the UN Secretary General. "We hope this meeting marks the beginning of a peaceful relationship between our worlds." Commander Vexthul clicked his mandibles together. "The Dreseri Empire acknowledges your greeting," he said through his translation device. "We have studied your civilization for some time. You are young, undisciplined. Your wars are chaotic and without honor." Susan felt her jaw tighten, but maintained a neutral expression. She had survived 3 wars and led troops through the Indonesian crisis. Being called undisciplined by an alien who had never faced human soldiers struck her as both insulting and dangerous. "Perhaps our peoples have different views on warfare," she said carefully. "But we come seeking peace, not to compare battle scars." The ambassador's glowing eyes fixed on her. "Your species claims to want peace, yet your history is filled with conflict." Curious, he turned to his aides and spoke in their clicking language before addressing the humans again. "We will consider your status in the galactic community. You may prove useful as a protectorate." General Rogers stepped forward. "With respect, Ambassador, Earth does not seek to be protected. We propose an equal alliance." The meeting continued for hours, growing increasingly tense. Susan noticed concerning patterns in the Dreseri delegation, the way they kept glancing at displays showing Earth's defense systems, their pointed questions about military capabilities, their dismissal of human achievements. When the meeting ended, the Dreseri departed abruptly, refusing the scheduled tour of Washington, D.C. "They're sizing us up," Susan told General Rogers as they walked to the Pentagon. "I've seen that look before, in Kosovo, in the faces of commanders planning an offensive. You think they came here to prepare for an attack? I think they came expecting to find us easy to intimidate. They seemed disappointed that we didn't simply bow to their superiority." 3 days later, Susan woke to blaring alarms. Her apartment view screen showed chaos in orbit. Dozens of Dreseri warships had appeared and opened fire on Earth's orbital defense platforms. She rushed to the Pentagon, where General Rogers was already coordinating the response. "They hit our lunar base first," he said grimly. "Then the orbital stations. Now they're deploying landing craft." The command center screen showed Earth's hastily assembled defense fleet engaging the Dreseri ships. The aliens clearly expected minimal resistance, but they had miscalculated badly. "Sierra Squadron moving to intercept landing craft over the Pacific," reported Air Force Colonel Gary Winters. "Navy missile defense systems online and targeting their support ships." Susan watched as the first wave of Dreseri fighters encountered Earth's F-38 space interceptors. The aliens had superior technology, but the human pilots flew with unpredictable aggression that seemed to confuse the enemy. Cheer went up as a squadron of pilots from Brazil executed a maneuver that trapped 3 Dreseri ships in a crossfire. On another screen, British and Indian orbital defense platforms coordinated their attack on a Dreseri cruiser, crippling its engines. "They expected us to panic," Susan said. "They don't understand what they've gotten themselves into." General Rogers nodded grimly. "This isn't their first conquest, but I'm betting they've never tried to take a world like ours before." As the battle in orbit reached a stalemate, Susan realized this would not be a quick war. The Dreseri had technology and numbers on their side, but they had made a critical error in their assessment of humanity. They thought they knew battle. They were about to learn how wrong they were. 6 months into the war with the Dreseri, Frank Daniels swept the floor of his hardware store in Lakewood, Ohio. At 58, his hair had turned completely gray, but his body remained strong from years of physical work. The small television in the corner played news about the ongoing conflict. Earth's forces were holding their own, but just barely. Frank paused his sweeping when the emergency broadcast signal sounded. The screen changed to show a stern-faced woman in a military uniform. "Attention all former military personnel," she announced. "The United Nations has activated the Veterans Reserve Protocol. All honorably discharged veterans under the age of 65 are being called back to service. Report to your nearest military processing center within 72 hours. The broom handle creaked under Frank's tightened grip. 25 years as a Marine, through conflicts in the Middle East, Venezuela, and the Korean reunification. He had retired 8 years ago, hoping never to hold a weapon again. His wife Kelly walked in from the back office. Her face showed she had heard the announcement too. "You knew this might happen," she said quietly. Kelly had served 16 years in the Air Force before becoming Frank's business partner, and then his wife. "I did," Frank replied, "but I hoped it wouldn't." The next morning, Frank stood in line at the Cleveland Military Processing Center with hundreds of other veterans. Some were in their 20s, fresh out of service. Others, like him, had gray hair and wrinkles earned through decades of life after their service. A young lieutenant scanned Frank's ID card. Marine Corps, 25 years, Master Sergeant, 3 combat tours, special qualifications in tactical systems and squad leadership. The lieutenant looked up at Frank with newfound respect. "We need people like you, sir." 3 days later, Frank found himself at Camp Morris, a hastily expanded training facility in western Pennsylvania. He joined 30 other veterans in a briefing room, all over 50 years old. Colonel Patricia Wright entered the room. Despite her pressed uniform, Frank could see the exhaustion in her eyes. "Welcome to the Grey Wolves," she said. "You are here because you have something the Dreseri don't understand. Experience. Their warriors train for centuries but fight in carefully controlled battles. You've fought in the chaos of real war." The colonel pointed to a map showing a mountain range. "A Dreseri scout ship crashed in the Rockies 2 days ago. Regular forces are tied up defending our cities. Your unit will deploy to secure the crash site and capture any survivors for intelligence." Frank and the other veterans received updated weapons training that afternoon. The rifles were lighter than what Frank remembered, with digital scopes and biometric locks, but they still fired bullets. Some things never changed. In his bunk that night, Frank stared at the ceiling. Across the room, a man named Joe Ramirez cleaned his rifle with practiced hands. Joe had been a Navy SEAL before becoming a high school principal. "Think we're too old for this?" Frank asked. Joe smiled slightly. "The Dreseri live for hundreds of years. Their youngest warriors are older than us, but they've never faced humans before." The next day, as Frank's unit boarded the transport helicopter, he received a message on his military tablet. It was from Kelly. "Just got my orders. Air Force needs flight instructors. Be safe. Remember, old wolves hunt smarter, not harder." High above the Rocky Mountains, Frank checked his equipment one last time. The intelligence officer had briefed them that Dreseri considered humans physically inferior and tactically predictable. They especially dismissed older humans as threats. 10 minutes to drop zone," the pilot announced. Frank looked around at his team. A former Army Ranger turned accountant, a retired Air Force pararescue specialist who now owned a restaurant, a Marine sniper who had become a grandmother of 3. The helicopter rocked suddenly as something struck it. Through the window, Frank saw a beam of energy flash past. "Dreseri ground fire," shouted the pilot. "They survived the crash and have defensive positions." Colonel Wright's voice came through their comms. "Grey Wolves, your mission just changed. Those Dreseri are using technology we haven't seen before. We need it intact. Good luck." As the helicopter made an emergency landing 2 miles from the crash site, Frank felt an old, familiar feeling. Not fear, not exactly. Focus. The clarity that came with danger. "They think we're just old humans," he told his team as they disembarked. Let's show them what Earth's veterans can do. General Krasvik slammed his fist on the holographic display, causing the image of Earth to flicker. Around the circular war chamber, 6 other Dreseri commanders watched their supreme leader with careful expressions. 6 months, Krasvik growled. 6 months, and we have barely established a foothold on this world. Explain this failure. Commander Zeltar stepped forward. The humans fight. Strangely, General, they do not follow proper battle doctrine. When we advance, they sometimes retreat, but other times they charge directly at our superior forces. Their tactics make no sense, added Commander Vax. In the African campaign, they abandoned valuable defensive positions to draw our forces into terrain that negated our technological advantages. Krasvik paced the chamber. These humans live barely a century. How have they developed such effective combat strategies in their brief existence? A smaller Dreseri entered the chamber. Unlike the warriors with their combat armor and ceremonial scars, this one wore simple robes. Nevlora was a cultural specialist, not a warrior. Permission to offer insight, General, she asked. Krasvik gestured impatiently. Speak. I have studied human history extensively, Nevlora said. Unlike our society, which engages in ceremonial warfare every few centuries, humans have been in almost constant conflict throughout their history. She activated a display showing human battles across time. Ancient armies with spears, medieval knights, modern soldiers. While we perfect a single combat doctrine over generations, humans have developed hundreds of different approaches to warfare. They adapt quickly because they must. Their short lives give them no choice. The general contemplated this information. Their veterans, the older humans, do they pose a special threat? Potentially the greatest threat, Nevlora confirmed. In our society, a warrior with a century of experience is still considered young. But human veterans have compressed decades of combat experience into their short lives. They've seen more actual combat than many of our warriors. In the Rocky Mountains, Frank Daniels signaled his team to halt. The crashed Dreseri ship lay in a small valley ahead, its sleek form partially buried in the earth. 4 Dreseri survivors had established a defensive perimeter, using debris as cover. Joe, what do you see? Frank whispered into his comm. Joe Ramirez peered through his scope from his position on a ridge. 4 targets. They're all watching the main approach. They've set up some kind of energy barrier facing the valley entrance. Frank nodded. The Dreseri expected an attack from the obvious direction. It was standard military doctrine. If you had limited resources, you defended against the most likely approach. Linda, can we circle around behind them? Linda Ortiz, who had retired from the army as a colonel before opening a successful bakery, studied her terrain map. There's a narrow path through those rocks. It would take a human about an hour to navigate. The Dreseri are larger. They'd probably decided it was impassable for their size. That's our way in, Frank decided. Mary, your team creates a distraction from the north in 30 minutes. My team will come in from behind. Mary Chin, the former Marine sniper, acknowledged the order with a quick hand signal. An hour later, Frank and 3 other veterans had navigated the narrow path. The rocks scraped their shoulders, and at several points, they had to remove their packs and push them ahead to squeeze through. No wonder the Dreseri hadn't considered this approach. From their new position, Frank could see the aliens clearly. They were focused entirely on the valley entrance. Their weapons, sleek rifles that glowed with blue energy, were impressive, but their tactics were rigid. On schedule, Mary's team fired several shots from the northern ridge, careful to aim wide. The Dreseri responded immediately, all 4 aliens turning to face the new threat, following what Frank guessed was their standard response protocol. Now, Frank whispered. His team emerged from the rocks, moving silently as they had been trained decades ago. The first Dreseri sensed something and began to turn, his amber eyes widening at the sight of the gray-haired humans approaching from what he had considered an impossible direction. Before the alien could raise an alarm, Linda fired her stun weapon. The Dreseri collapsed, followed quickly by his 3 companions. Targets secured, Frank reported into his comm. You know, for a species that's lived for centuries, they don't seem to have learned much about adapting to unexpected situations. Joe chuckled as he joined them from his sniper position. Maybe living too long makes you inflexible. These folks could learn something from us old dogs. As the team secured the alien technology for transport, Frank couldn't help but wonder what other misconceptions the Dreseri had about Earth's veterans, and how those mistakes might help humanity win this war. Admiral Helen Bishop stood before a room filled with an unusual mix of people. Military officers in crisp uniforms sat beside elderly civilians in casual clothes. The large screen behind her showed the current positions of Earth and Dreseri fleets. Operation Throwback begins tomorrow, she announced. Our conventional tactics aren't working against the Dreseri. Their predictive systems anticipate our standard military doctrine. So we're going to give them something their computers can't predict. Strategies from our past. She nodded to an elderly woman in the front row. Dr. Nancy Rivera, would you explain your contribution? Dr. Rivera stood slowly, using a cane for support. At 72, she had spent her career studying ancient military history before retiring 10 years ago. The Battle of Cannae, 216 BC, she said, her voice surprisingly strong. Hannibal defeated a much larger Roman force using a double envelopment strategy. His center line deliberately weakened and fell back when attacked, while his stronger wings held firm and then surrounded the Romans. The admiral pointed to the display showing Jupiter's moon Europa, where Dreseri ships had established a base. We've modified Hannibal's strategy for space warfare. The Dreseri expect us to defend our mining operations on Europa with a strong central force. Instead, we'll position our strongest ships on the flanks, hidden behind the moon's radiation signature. Back on Earth, Frank Daniels and his Grey Wolves unit had been reassigned. After their successful mission in the Rockies, they were now at Fort Jackson, training younger soldiers in adaptive combat techniques. No, not like that, Frank told a young corporal who was setting up an ambush position during a training exercise. The Dreseri have thermal vision that can detect your body heat through thin cover. Use the terrain to mask your signature. The corporal, Eric Washington, frowned. With respect, sir, the manual says this position gives optimal fields of fire. The manual was written for fighting humans, Frank replied patiently. I've seen Dreseri in action. Trust me on this. Eric reluctantly adjusted his position. Later that day, when simulated Dreseri forces attacked their training area, Eric's squad was the only one that remained undetected. How did you know? Eric asked Frank afterward. Afghanistan, 2034. Frank answered. We learned to hide from thermal drones by using rock formations to absorb and disperse our heat signatures. Old trick, new application. In orbit around Europa, Admiral Bishop's fleet engaged the Dreseri. Her central ships made a show of defending the mining stations, then appeared to weakly fall back under pressure. The Dreseri commander, seeing an opportunity, pressed forward into what seemed like a collapsing human defense. They're taking the bait, reported Captain Ben Oliver from the bridge of the UNS Intrepid. Their formation is extending to envelop our center. Admiral Bishop watched the tactical display calmly. Signal the flanking units. Execute now. From behind Europa's north and south poles, 2 groups of Earth's most powerful warships emerged from hiding. They accelerated rapidly, their trajectories forming the arms of a giant pincer. The Dreseri commander realized the trap too late. His extended formation was now caught between 3 human forces. The flanking ships cut off his retreat while the center force, which had only pretended to be weak, turned to attack. The Carthaginians defeated Rome using this tactic more than 2,000 years ago. Admiral Bishop said quietly as the battle unfolded. Sometimes the old ways work best. On the main Dreseri warship, Commander Vux stared at his tactical display in disbelief. Impossible, he muttered. Their maneuver matches nothing in their modern military databases. Where did this come from? His tactical officer looked up in confusion. Sir, the human ships are not following any recognized doctrine. Our predictive systems cannot calculate their next move. For the first time in the war, a major Dreseri fleet retreated in disarray. As they limped back to their main force, they left behind a significant victory for humanity. In her command center, Admiral Bishop received congratulations from her officers. She turned to Dr. Rivera and the other elderly historians who had helped design the strategy. This is just the beginning, the Admiral said. Humanity has thousands of years of military history to draw from, and the Dreseri are about to get a lesson in every single one of them. 14 months into the war, General Krasvik stood before the Dreseri High Command. The mood in the Grand Chamber was tense. What had begun as a simple conquest had become a costly, prolonged conflict. The humans continue to adapt, Krasvik said. Our losses at Europa were significant. They are using combat methods that do not appear in any of their military databases. Supreme Leader Drenthal's eyes narrowed. You assured us this species would fall quickly. I was wrong, Krasvik admitted. But I have developed a new strategy. We have been fighting a limited war, testing their defenses. I propose we commit our elite warriors to a full ground invasion. The Supreme Leader considered this. The Crimson Guard has not been deployed in 5 centuries. This enemy deserves our respect, Krasvik said, and our full strength. 3 days later, red light filled the skies above Chicago as hundreds of Dreseri landing craft descended through the atmosphere. Unlike the earlier, smaller attacks, this was a massive invasion force led by the legendary Crimson Guard, warriors who had trained for combat since before humans had electricity. National Guard units and local defense forces scrambled to respond. The city's defense system had been prepared for an attack, but not one of this magnitude. Colonel Linda Hayes had been shopping for groceries when the alert sounded. At 65, she had retired from the Army years ago after a distinguished career. Now she found herself at a makeshift command center in a high school gym, surrounded by nervous younger officers. The Dreseri are advancing from the north, reported Captain Paul Garcia. They've already overrun our outer defenses. Standard tactics aren't working. Linda studied the tactical display. The Dreseri moved in perfect formation, each unit supporting the others in a textbook advance. Too textbook, she realized. They're fighting like it's an open battlefield, she said. But we're in a city. She turned to the officers. Forget the standard defense plan. We're switching to urban guerrilla tactics. I want small, mobile teams. Hit and run attacks. Use the buildings, sewers, and subway tunnels. Captain Garcia looked uncertain. Ma'am, that's not in our defensive playbook. It's in mine, Linda replied firmly. I learned urban warfare in Puerto Rico in 2029. Trust me. In orbit, Lieutenant Commander Alan Parker now commanded his own ship, the UNS Valiant. Since the success of Operation Throwback, human forces had been winning more engagements, but something troubled him as he reviewed the latest battle reports. They're copying us, he told his executive officer, Lisa Brown. Look at this engagement near Mars. The Dreseri used a flanking maneuver similar to our Europa strategy. Lisa studied the data. They're learning our tactics. Which means we need something they can't easily copy, Alan said. Something uniquely human. He called an emergency meeting of his ship commanders. When they assembled in the Valiant's conference room, Alan explained the problem. The Dreseri are quick learners. They're already adapting to our historical tactics. But they have one significant weakness. They all train the same way. Their military is completely uniform. He gestured to the officers around the table, men and women from different countries, different military traditions. Our strength is our diversity. I want each of you to implement combat doctrines from your own national military traditions. Chinese, Russian, Brazilian, Nigerian, all different approaches happening simultaneously. In Chicago, Linda's unconventional tactics were working. The Dreseri Crimson Guard found themselves fighting an enemy that refused to meet them in open battle. Instead, small teams of humans struck quickly from unexpected directions, then disappeared into the urban landscape. "This is not proper combat," growled Vorzak, the Crimson Guard commander, as another human ambush decimated one of his patrols. "They should stand and fight with honor." In her command post, Linda received reports of Dreseri forces becoming increasingly disorganized as they pushed deeper into the city. Her strategy was working. The aliens' superior technology and training meant little in the concrete maze of Chicago, where veterans who had fought in urban conflicts around the world now taught younger soldiers how to turn a city into a battlefield. They thought they were invading a target, Linda told her officers. Instead, they walked into a trap. Every building is a fortress, every street a potential ambush site. This is how humanity has fought for centuries when facing a stronger enemy. As night fell over Chicago, the Dreseri advance had completely stalled. For the first time, the elite Crimson Guard faced the possibility of defeat at the hands of what they had considered an inferior species. A blinding flash lit up the sky over Denver. When it faded, every electronic device in the city had stopped working. Cars rolled to a halt. Phones went dark. Military communication systems fell silent. The Dreseri had deployed their new weapon, a massive electromagnetic pulse that disabled all advanced technology within a 50-mile radius. Within hours, similar pulses hit cities and military bases across North America. In the Pentagon's backup command center, deep underground and protected from the pulse, General Rogers met with his increasingly desperate staff. "They've taken out our most advanced weapon systems," reported Major Samantha. "Satellite guidance, drone networks, targeting computers, all down. We're effectively fighting with 20th century technology now." Frank Daniels, recently promoted to the Strategic Command Team due to his success with the Grey Wolves, saw several officers exchange worried glances. Without their high-tech advantages, many of the younger commanders felt lost. "This might actually work in our favor," Frank said calmly. Everyone turned to look at him. "Our younger soldiers depend on technology, but there are thousands of veterans who trained and fought before we had all these fancy gadgets." General Rogers considered this. "You're suggesting we rely more heavily on our older veterans, the ones who know how to fight without advanced tech." "Exactly," Frank replied. "I trained with paper maps and compass navigation. I know how to coordinate attacks using radio instead of satellite links. Most veterans my age do too." 2 days later, Frank led a team of 40 veterans into the Appalachian Mountains. Their mission: destroy a Dreseri electronics nullifying transmitter that had been located in an abandoned coal mine. Without functioning vehicles, they hiked through forest and mountain terrain, navigating by compass and stars. "Just like old times," said Steve Williams, a former Army Ranger in his 50s. "Reminds me of training exercises before GPS became standard." The team included veterans from different eras of warfare. Some had served in the 2020s Korean conflict, others in the climate wars of the 2030s. Their average age was 53, and they carried a mix of simple, reliable weapons that required no electronics to function. As they approached the Dreseri position on the 3rd day, Frank divided them into 4 groups. Using hand signals and prearranged bird calls, they coordinated their movements without any electronic communication that the Dreseri might detect. The aliens had set up their transmitter in a clearing, surrounded by patrol units. Their security was focused on detecting electronic signatures or vehicle approaches, not a group of humans moving quietly through the woods on foot. "Look at their setup," whispered Karen Roberts, a former Marine Scout. "They're scanning for drones and vehicles, not people walking in." Frank nodded. "They think we can't fight without our tech." Big mistake. The veterans encircled the Dreseri position, using techniques developed across decades of human conflicts. When Frank gave the signal, 3 quick shots from his rifle. They attacked from all sides simultaneously. The Dreseri guards were thrown into confusion. Their combat training prepared them for enemies using advanced technology, not for humans using simple weapons and techniques from wars fought decades earlier. Within 20 minutes, the transmitter was under human control. Frank's team rigged it with basic explosives and destroyed it. As they began their trek back to base, the electronic devices they carried gradually came back to life. Meanwhile, Admiral Bishop was implementing Project Babel, a communication network using methods so old they were new again. Morse code transmitted by simple radio, flag signals between ships, field telephones connected by physical wires. The Dreseri can intercept and decode our digital communications, she explained to her staff. But these methods are so antiquated they won't even think to look for them. In her headquarters, Dr. Nancy Rivera coordinated a team of retired communication specialists, some in their 70s, who were teaching younger operators how to use these outdated systems. When I was a young lieutenant, she told a group of bewildered communications officers, we trained to use these methods as backup systems. Now they're our primary advantage. Across Earth, the pattern repeated. Where the Dreseri expected to face a helpless enemy without technology, they instead encountered veterans who remembered how to fight the old way, with paper maps, analog equipment, and battle-tested tactics that required no computers or advanced electronics. The Dreseri had successfully disabled humanity's technological edge. But in doing so, they had unwittingly revealed their own greatest weakness, dependence on predictable, technology-centered warfare against an enemy who remembered how to fight without it. After 2 years of brutal conflict, the main conference room of the United Nations building in Geneva buzzed with tension. Human leaders sat on one side of the long table. Across from them, a delegation of Dreseri officials waited in silence. This was the first formal peace talk between the two species. President Laura Wells of the United Earth Government nodded to the Dreseri emissary. You requested this meeting. Ambassador Krenduril. We are listening. The tall Dreseri rose from his seat. Unlike the military commanders humans had faced in battle, Krenduril wore simple robes instead of armor. His 4 arms remained uncrossed in what humans had learned was a gesture of openness. For centuries, the Dreseri Empire has expanded through conquest. He began. Never before have we encountered such resistance. Your species has earned our respect. Frank Daniels, now serving as a military advisor to the president, studied the alien carefully. After dozens of encounters with Dreseri forces, he had learned to read their body language. The ambassador seemed genuine. The High Command has authorized me to negotiate terms for a ceasefire, Krenduril continued, not as a prelude to surrender, but as the beginning of a lasting peace between equals. Murmurs spread through the human delegation. After 2 years of fighting, the possibility of peace seemed almost unreal. What changed? Asked Admiral Bishop. Your forces still control significant territory in our solar system. Krenduril's amber eyes fixed on her. We have studied your history extensively. In our culture, warfare is ritualized, conducted according to ancient codes. But your veterans, he paused, they fight with a wisdom that comes only from experiencing true conflict. The ambassador activated a holographic display showing battles from the war. Your older warriors, despite their physical limitations, consistently outmaneuvered our forces. They showed creativity and adaptability that our training cannot replicate. As negotiations continued over the next 3 days, both sides worked toward a framework for peace. But not everyone wanted the fighting to end. On the 4th morning, explosions rocked the building. Separatist attack, shouted a security officer as the conference room's windows shattered. A faction of Dreseri warriors opposed to peace had joined with human extremists who wanted to continue the war. Frank and the other veterans in the room reacted instantly. Despite being in their 60s, they moved with the speed and precision that came from decades of combat experience. Frank pulled President Wells to safety while Colonel Linda Hayes, also part of the diplomatic team, organized a defensive position using overturned furniture. What surprised everyone was that Ambassador Krenduril and his guards immediately joined the humans in defending the peace conference. Human and Dreseri veterans, who had been mortal enemies for 2 years, now fought side by side against the attackers. Left flank, called out a Dreseri guard named Throwback. Frank nodded and moved to cover that area, working seamlessly with the alien warrior as if they had trained together for years. Both understood the universal language of combat. After 20 tense minutes, security forces secured the building. The attack had failed. As medical teams treated the wounded, Frank found himself standing next to Throwback. "You fight well for a human of your age," the Dreseri said. Frank smiled slightly. "You're not bad yourself. How long have you been a warrior?" 170 years, Throwback replied. "But I have never experienced combat like these past 2 years against your people." Later that evening, something unprecedented occurred. General Krasvik, the Dreseri military commander who had led the invasion of Earth, requested a private meeting with human veterans over the age of 60. "I wish to understand," he told the group of gray-haired men and women. "In our culture, warfare is honorable but controlled. You fight as if each battle might be your last." "Because it might be," answered Linda Hayes simply. "When you only live 100 years at most, you don't have the luxury of centuries to perfect fighting techniques. You learn quickly or you die." As the night wore on, human and Dreseri veterans shared their perspectives on war and peace. Despite vast differences in biology and culture, they found common ground in their experiences of battle. "Perhaps," General Krasvik said as the meeting concluded, "this is the beginning of a new understanding between our peoples, not based on conquest, but on mutual respect born on the battlefield." 5 years after the first Dreseri ships appeared in Earth's skies, Frank Daniels stood on the observation deck of Unity Station, a massive structure orbiting Jupiter. Through the reinforced windows, he watched as ships from both species moved in formation, conducting joint exercises against simulated threats. The peace treaty, signed 3 years earlier, was unlike any the Dreseri had ever made before. Instead of demanding Earth's submission, it established a partnership based on mutual respect and shared interests. Frank, now serving as a senior advisor to Earth's diplomatic corps, had helped design a key component of the agreement. "The veteran exchange program was your idea," said a deep voice behind him. Frank turned to see General Krasvik, his former enemy now an unexpected friend. The Dreseri commander had aged little in the 5 years since the war began, but his perspective had changed dramatically. "It seemed logical," Frank replied. "If veterans from both sides understood each other so quickly, why not build on that?" The program paired retired warriors from both species. Human veterans traveled to Dreseri worlds to teach adaptability and creative thinking, while Dreseri veterans came to Earth to share their centuries of tactical knowledge. What began as a tentative experiment had grown into the foundation of the peace. In a training room nearby, 60-year-old Linda Hayes demonstrated hand-to-hand combat techniques to a group of young Dreseri warriors. Despite her age and the alien's superior strength, her movements were precise and effective. "Humans call this judo," she explained as she used a Dreseri trainee's momentum against him, sending the much larger alien tumbling to the mat. "It was developed centuries ago on Earth. The principle is to use your opponent's strength to your advantage." The young Dreseri warriors watched with respect. In their culture, age had always been associated with wisdom, but rarely with practical combat skills. The human veterans were changing that perception. On the command deck, Admiral Helen Bishop and her Dreseri counterpart, Admiral Zevrak, monitored reports of an emerging threat. A previously unknown species had begun attacking outposts on the edge of explored space, and their ships were approaching the solar system. "The defensive line should be here," Zevrak said, indicating a position near Saturn. Bishop shook her head. "Too predictable. They'll expect that." She moved the holographic markers to show an alternative strategy. "Let's position our main force behind Jupiter's moons, with light scout ships as bait." Zevrak considered the plan. 5 years ago, he would have dismissed such an unorthodox approach. Now he nodded in agreement. A trap within a trap. They will not anticipate this combined approach. As preparations for the defense continued, Frank received a visitor in his quarters. A young Dreseri named Krell, barely 50 years old, equivalent to a human teenager, had been assigned as his new aide. "I am honored to serve you, Elder Frank," Krell said formally. "My grandfather fought against you in the Battle of Chicago. He told me to seek your wisdom." Frank smiled. "Your grandfather was with the Crimson Guard." "Yes, Elder." He said that losing to your veterans was the most valuable lesson of his 300 years. Frank gestured for the young Dreseri to sit. "Then let me tell you about your grandfather's generation and mine, about how we found more in common as former enemies than we sometimes do with our own young people." As night fell over Unity Station, a ceremony began in the Great Hall. Human and Dreseri veterans who had once tried to kill each other now stood side by side, receiving commendations for their work maintaining peace. Among them was Susan Miller, the military liaison who had first recognized the Dreseri threat years ago. "They came looking for conquest," she said in her speech. "They thought they knew battle, having trained for it for centuries. Instead, they met Earth's veterans, people who had lived warfare, not just studied it. And in that meeting, both our species found something unexpected: recognition." Later, as the combined human-Dreseri fleet prepared to defend against the new threat, Frank stood on the bridge of the flagship alongside General Krasvik. Looking at the crew, young humans learning from Dreseri elders, veteran Dreseri warriors adopting human tactical flexibility, Frank realized they had created something unprecedented. "We turned enemies into allies," he said quietly, "not through fear or domination, but through the shared understanding that only comes from carrying the weight of battle." Krasvik nodded solemnly. "In the end, old warrior, your species taught mine the most important lesson of all. True strength comes not from how long you live, but from how well you learn from the battles you survive."